All right, so my talk today is about choline. And I'm going to guess that other than some of the nutrition students, a lot of you may or may not have actually heard of this nutrient. Choline is what we would call a vitamin-like essential nutrient. The word was actually derived from the Greek term for bile, the word chol, because it was first isolated from ox bile in about 1862. And until recently, choline was thought to be dispensable, meaning that we didn't actually need to consume it in our diets because we can actually produce choline in our livers in something called a de novo biosynthesis pathway. One of the things we do know is that how much choline we require is dependent on its relationship with the other one carbon nutrients because they share an interconnected pathway. This includes methionine, folate, and vitamin B12. But it's only become recently that we've recognized that we actually need choline in our diets because of various factors that can influence how much it works in our bodies and how much we actually need. But however, it's still under-recognized and under-consumed by the general population and even healthcare professionals. If you would actually ask your family doctor if they know what choline is, you might not get a straight answer simply because it is very under-recognized as an essential nutrient. It's only in 2010 that its choline values for food has actually been added to the USDA nutrient database in the Canadian Nutrifile. When you look in your nutrition facts panel on your food, all that information comes from these databases. And the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey actually only started to measure how much choline people were consuming in about 2000 and 2014. And the 2015 nutrient data from the Canadian Community Health Survey didn't actually even include choline because the data in those databases, the nutrient databases, is still somewhat inconsistent. One of the things we do know is that low intakes of choline is associated with liver function in men and postmenopausal women. It's also associated with muscle damage and death of white blood cells in our lymph system. Now, choline is not just one form. It's actually a number of different related forms, all of which provide what we would call bioavailable choline. And this includes choline, glycerylphosphocholine, phosphocholine, phosphatidylcholine, sphingomyelin, and betaine, which is actually a metabolite of choline. All these together are referred to as total dietary choline. They do differ in how much we can actually absorb. So bioavailability means the difference between how much you take in versus how much you absorb, simply because some of these forms, choline, glycerylphosphocholine, phosphocholine, and betaine, are what we would call water-soluble versus the fat-soluble phosphatidylcholine and sphingomyelin, because they have different absorption pathways in the body. So that changes how much we actually get. Now, choline has a number of different functions in the body that include different structural and regulatory roles. Choline can be methylated to be oxidized in the one carbon pathway where it's related to the folate, B6, and B12. And it serves as one of the primary methyl donors in the body along with folate. And the end product of these pathways is the production of S-adenosine methionine, which is serves as substrate for the synthesis of numerous compounds in the body, but also serves as one of the primary compounds that helps to methylate DNA, RNA in our bodies, as well as histones. And histones are just the compounds that help to organize DNA in our cells. Choline can also be acetylated to form acetylcholine, where it's involved in the production of neurotransmitters, involved in learning, memory, and organization and formation of the brain. Choline can also be phosphorylated and undergoes a number of transformations, where it then is used as compounds in the body, in lipid transport, cell division, and membrane biogenesis. Choline does play a very critical role in reproduction because of these essential roles in the body. As I mentioned, those phospholipids that are formed from the phosphorylation help to form cells and membranes in our body. They help to serve in the myelination of nerve axon. Myelination is that waxy coating that forms on nerves, acting as an insulator to protect our nerves. It's useful in cell division when in both the developing fetus and in the placenta, and it's involved in lipid transport, lipids being our cholesterols. Acetylcholine is required for neurogenesis, the formation and development of nerves in the brain in our bodies. It also helps to improve hippocampal function. The hippocampus is part of the brain that has a major role in learning and memory. We also know that higher amounts of acetylcholine accumulate in the placenta, where it actually helps to serve to signal in this differentiation of cells. Differentiation means where they take on the different roles, like bone cells and blood cells. Betaine and folate are the methyl donors for adenosine, which both serves as substrate for DNA and the histones. And this helps to establish and maintain what we call the fetal epigenome. And this is, the epigenome is where the marks on our DNA, which help the cells differentiate. Choline is also important because it helps to protect against various birth defects. The neurotube is formed in the first 28 days of pregnancy. So if it doesn't form properly, defects can occur in that time period, especially in days 21 to 28. Spina bifida is probably one of the most common neurotube defects that you might be aware of. We know that choline has an independent risk of related to neurotube developments if with inadequate intakes. And there are several studies that have looked at this. Two of them have found that higher intakes of choline, when compared to very low intakes, actually reduce the risk for neurotube defects anywhere from 51 to 76%. Another study, which was a case control, looked at pregnancies both with and without neurotube defects, but found no association between maternal blood concentrations and neurotube defects. Now, that might be because the circulating choline concentrations in our blood don't actually reflect choline intake. Other birth defects that are associated with low maternal choline intake include cleft lip and cleft palate, hypospadias, which is when the urethra opening forms on the underside of the penis versus the tip, as well as cardiac defects. Because choline has such a critical role in the development of the neurons and in cognitive function, there's a lot of studies that have looked at whether or not choline might play a role in being protected in various types of neurological diseases, including epilepsy, Down syndrome, schizophrenia, and autism, and prenatal exposure, alcohol exposure. Now, all the evidence for this comes from animal models, because animal models are much easier to give high doses, and animals have very short lives. But all the animal models actually showed that choline can be quite protective in preventing neurodegeneration of the brain and stabilizing spatial cognition and reducing and potentially preventing risk for something like schizophrenia and autism. So that's really important. However, when we look at the human studies, because of course humans live much longer than mice, we're not mice after all. Mice can live for about a year and we could live a lot longer than that, as well as quite not ethical to give high doses to humans and not give dose to another group. But the studies that have looked, given smaller doses or more realistic doses, did find that there are some evidence of neuroprotection in choline, even in humans. One study that gave about 2 times the current recommendation in the last trimester of pregnancy found that the infant's processing speed and visual spatial memory at 13 months of age was much higher. And they even found that even if they had much more modest doses than even 2 times, about the AI, the recommendation are a little bit higher, they actually found still that the infants had positive cognitive benefits and they had increased faster reaction times, even if the dose is given over a longer period at a much lower level. Other studies have found no association between the plasma choline and the cognition in the children at between 5 and 7 years of age. However, one of the choline metabolites is still as positive as associated with language development. So overall, the evidence is suggestive that there may be some benefit to giving choline, especially during pregnancy, especially when we combine it with some of the other methyl donors, those other nutrients in the pathway. Even when we look at just adults who are suffering from Alzheimer's disease, using the methyl donors, choline, B12, B6, and folic acid, we found that those Alzheimer's patients showed improved signaling and improved memory a longer period, suggesting that even in adults, choline supplements may be of benefit. Now, right at the beginning, I talked about the fact that we produce choline in our bodies. And I realize this is a very confusing slide, especially if you're not in sciences. But the take-home message here is that we produce choline in our bodies, producing phosphatidylcholine, the lipid, which then can undergo various uses across the body. But we also produce homocysteine, which is used in amino acid synthesis. Now, increases of homocysteine in our body can have negative effects because it is linked to atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, along with cardiovascular disease. The other take home here is what regulates this pathway. And what I want you to notice is this, is that estrogen is one of the primary regulators of this pathway in our livers. Women do have a much higher capacity for producing choline in our bodies because it's regulated by estrogen. And this makes sense if you think about it in terms of neurodevelopment being especially important during pregnancy and during lactation. Now, other than the fetal development, there are adverse health outcomes associated with choline deficiency, even in adults. We know that there is an increase in liver damage. So ALT is serum alanine aminotransferase, which is one of the enzymes used to measure liver damage in the regular adults. Some of you may have had this test done. And one study found that healthy men who did not given choline for about 3 weeks suffered liver damage and muscle damage with that deficit of choline, because they found that the lack of choline altered the structural integrity and cell permeability, creating tissue damage. But it also, we found because of the lack of choline, because choline has a role in our cholesterol, that patients developed fatty liver because of accumulating triglycerides in the liver, because the proteins weren't there to transport it around the body. We also know that there's some suggestion in the literature that because of that increased homocysteine concentration, because of that de novo pathway, along with something called trimethylamine N oxide accumulation, or TMAO, accumulating in the body, are also associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, TMAO is produced in the body when we consume cholesterol. It's broken down in our gut by the bacteria in our gut. They produce something called TMA, which then is oxidized in the liver, producing TMAO. Choline supplementation will reduce homocysteine, but there's other studies that have found that even reducing homocysteine using the B vitamins really didn't decrease our risk for cardiovascular disease. Further, there's some suggestion that the choline in eggs, when it's converted to TMO, is actually excreted in the kidneys and doesn't accumulate in the blood. So right now, this link with TMAO and heart disease is still under research, and one of the things that's being looked at. There's no conclusive evidence at this point in time. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that how much choline we need is variable. And part of that has to do with genetic variants, or changes in how the genes work in these various pathways. 1-carbon metabolism is quite complicated, and the changes that occur in the PME, the de novo synthesis pathway for choline, can also be quite complicated. And we know that any variance in those pathways can actually impair choline and well as folate metabolism. There's been evidence to suggest that at least 9 different genes in what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, in these pathways increase our requirements significantly, well above the current recommendations for choline. One study found that about 22% of women in the United States have just 2 out of the 9 different variants in that endogenous pathway that actually makes the gene unresponsive to estrogen, meaning that especially during pregnancy and lactation, these women are going to require much higher amounts of choline than another woman who does not have those variants. Not surprisingly, we do find choline in breast milk, which makes sense because the brain is still developing after birth and develops substantively in the first 2 years of infant development. So human milk is a very rich source of choline compounds, and it's a combination of various compounds, but especially phosphocholine is especially high, which is one of those water-soluble forms. What's interesting, though, is that the concentrations of choline double in the first 2 weeks of pregnancy after birth, or first 2 weeks after birth, and then remain stable beyond 6 months, in that period when the brain is developing so quickly in that growing infant. The choline that comes in breast milk is either transported from maternal circulation from our diets, or through that de novo synthesis pathway. Because choline is found in breast milk, most infant formula companies do manufacture formula based on the composition of breast milk. And they use mature human milk as their guideline for developing that the composition of formula. And so they have added choline to infant formula, but the forms of choline in the different forms, types of formula do vary across the different formulations and across the brands. Most of the companies do add choline as choline chloride, but they may also add a small amount of lecithin, which comes from soy. There are also differences whether the formula is either cow milk based or whether it's soy milk based, because the choline that's in the bovine forms has lower fat soluble forms, but higher water soluble forms versus the soy based formula. At this time, though, we really don't understand the impact of using these different forms in developing infant, because the research is just not there yet, and we don't really understand the long-term impact of these different forms of choline in infant formula. Okay, I talked about how much choline, what choline does in the body, where we find it. Next question is, how much do we actually need versus how much are we actually getting? So this study, this slide is showing the various amounts for women, and that's what's circled here in red. And you can see on the left-hand side, the average woman of reproductive age requires about 425 milligrams of choline per day. Not surprisingly, this increases substantively during pregnancy to 450 milligrams a day, but because of choline being found in breast milk, there's a huge leap once when we're talking lactation to 550 milligrams a day. So that's how much we actually require. Now, there's a lack of evidence for what bases this requirement. This is called an AI, which means an average intake, rather than an estimated average requirement. So that study, when I talked about the liver damage earlier on in the men when they took the choline away, that's actually the study that was used to derive these AIs. This comes from one study that was done in men, and it was what we called a repletion study, where we took choline away, then give it back to them to prevent the damage. So at this point in time, the AI for choline is actually based on preventing liver damage, not the development of neurocognitive development of infants. That being said, when you look at this slide again, those little bars at the front, that actually represents the intake, the average intake of women and men based on the group that we're looking at here in US data. And you can see that those blue bars are much smaller than those requirements. Most of the evidence suggests that about anywhere from 85 to 90% of women do not meet that AI for choline intake. That AI is based on an average intake of about 7.5 milligrams per kilo. At this point in time, there is limited evidence of what choline intakes look like in Canadian women. So what's here on the slide is some of the evidence that's out there. First, we have the evidence from the Alberta Pregnancy Outcomes and Nutrition Study, or the APRN study, which is well named if you think about it. This comes from about 600 pregnant women in Alberta, Canada, where they're looking at the women at pregnancy and then for about 5 years after. So this is what we would call a prospective study. The women are actually being followed over the time. They looked at the choline intakes in the pregnant women, and they found that the average intake was about 347 milligrams per day. Now, remember I said for pregnant women, the intake is supposed to be 450 milligrams. what they found was only about 23% of the women in this study were meeting that recommendation. Another study looked at women in downtown Toronto, pregnant women in downtown Toronto. Here, they found an even lower average intake of about 306 milligrams a day, with about 87% of the women in this study not meeting that recommendation. So this is one of my areas of interest in research, and I looked at the Canadian Community Health Survey. I looked at, which was done, the nutrient data was done both in 2004 and in 2015. And I looked at non-pregnant, non-lactating women of reproductive age between 18 and 45. And in my 2004 data, I found an even lower, slightly lower intake of about 297 milligrams a day, with women, about 82 to 87% of the women not meeting the recommendation. We then did the same type of analysis using the 2015 data. And again, here we found lower intake, with about 97% or 90% of Canadian women of reproductive age not meeting that recommendation for choline. What was unique about the 2015 data is that it allowed us to actually look at intake in vegetarian women, or women who declared that they were vegetarian. And given that choline is found primarily in animal foods, and we'll talk about that next, the intake for vegetarian women was even lower than the average women of reproductive age, with an intake of less than 200 milligrams, with about 95% of women who said they were vegetarian not meeting that AI. So where do we find choline? Well, because choline is found in that phosphatidylcholine is found primarily in animal foods, with beef liver, of course, being one of the best sources, but realistically speaking, most of us don't eat liver. One of the next best sources by weight is eggs. The average egg has about 147 milligrams of choline in it, which is about a good, more than a little quarter of your daily intake. But of course, if you don't eat meat, where can you find choline? Well, there are a number of good vegetarian sources. Soy is actually a really excellent source, with a cup of soy milk having about 57 milligrams. Now, obviously, this is substantively lower than the eggs and the beef, but it still can be a decent source. A half a cup of kidney beans can actually have 45 milligrams of choline. And if you like your broccoli, eat lots of it, because it's also a really good source of choline, with about a cup of broccoli having about 62 milligrams a day. And even that banana you had for breakfast has some choline in it. It has about 11 milligrams a day. I wanted to know then what foods women of reproductive age in Canada were eating in order to get their choline. So using that 2004 data, I looked at what foods women were consuming, and I broke it down by various groups, looking at meat intake, dairy intake, including eggs, and of course fruits, vegetables, and legumes, because legumes can be a decent source of choline. Not surprisingly, 11.5% of our choline intake came from eggs. It was the most frequently consumed food by women, contributing to their choline intake. Milk was the next highest source on total, with about almost just under 10%. Chicken and beef rounded up the top four. Well, it was nice to see that about 22% of fruits, vegetables, legumes do contribute to our choline intake as women. When we looked at the same type of analysis in the 2015 data, we found very similar patterns. Eggs did increase slightly to about 15.5%, and the chicken and milk switch places, with chicken having a little more emphasis in terms of choline contribution versus milk, and beef making up the top four. But then, of course, I wanted to know what a vegetarian was eating. What foods were vegetarians eating that would contribute to their choline intake? So when we did the analysis, not surprising, if you're vegetarian, vegetarians do include eggs and dairy. Someone who's a vegan would not. We were not able to analyze vegan. There just wasn't enough women in the sample for us to do that type of analysis. So they were sort of clumped together with these women here. But eggs did have a huge role in how much choline was being consumed by these women, with, nice to know, legumes being second highest on the list. So this includes soy, which is one of the more higher containing legumes for choline. 2% milk was next on the list. But what made number 4 for me, and this made me extremely happy, was plant-based beverages contributed about 6% of total choline intake to these women, with plant-based proteins overall contributing about 18%. Now, soy milk will be the driver here because soy milk is actually a really good source of choline for women. Okay, that's food. What about supplements? Because the reality is most of us will use supplements if we don't think our diets are really are good enough. Well, the majority of multivitamin mineral supplements that are on the market do not contain choline. Choline salts are quite heavy and would significantly increase the bulk of any type of supplement it's in. Pregnancy supplements like Materna also do not contain choline at this point in time. There is some discussion about whether or not it should be added, but when you currently check, it's still not there. You can buy just choline supplements, and that's what's the little picture here in the top of the corner. Typically in the form of phosphatidylcholine, lecithin, capsules or granules are often sold, and they contain about 35% phosphatidylcholine. Now, the problem with any type of supplement use is that when we talk about food, generally we don't talk about excessive consumption. It is very hard to have an excessive consumption of any type of food where you start having ill effects of the nutrient. But it's very easy when you're taking supplements. And we know that excessive consumption of choline from supplements, when we're talking about 7,500 milligrams a day, it's associated with a significant drop in blood pressure, profuse sweating, a very distinctive fishy body odor, and some rather nasty tummy effects. So if you are considering taking a choline supplement, you do want to stay very well within the recommended dose if you are able to. So then thinking about that, I wanted to know, well, are women using supplements to get some of their choline? So again, we looked at that 2015 Canadian Community Health Survey data, wanting to look at whether choline was being consumed in supplements, since we know they're not really getting enough of it in food. Now, of course, because the 2015 data didn't actually include choline in their analysis, we actually had to do some cross-referencing with the Natural Health Products Database. In Canada, supplements are regulated under Natural Health Products through Health Canada, so we had to cross-reference with their databases. When we did that, we found that only about 4% of women consume choline in some form of a supplement, either as choline bitartrate, or as lecithin. And the average intake from supplements was about 24 milligrams in form of choline, or about 84 milligrams when it was choline bitartrate. Now, that's interesting considering that about 25% of women do contain a multivitamin that does not contain choline. The next question is, are there any adverse effects from a mother taking a really high intake of choline or even any of these one-carbon nutrients during pregnancy? Any of the studies that have been done so far have not given excessive high intakes of choline to any of the women, and they've not found any negative outcomes. And if anything, the benefits have either not really been shown based on the level of intake, or they have been showing positive benefits. However, the animal studies where we can get excessive high amounts have suggested that diets that are given really rich in these one-carbon nutrients, folic acid, choline, betaine, and even vitamin B12, could potentially increase the risk for a number of GI diseases like inflammatory bowel disease or colitis, alter our immune response in the colon, in the mucus in the colon mucosa, and create a much more reactive airway. And this seems to suggest that any of these one carbon nutrients may have, especially choline and folate, may have what's called a U-shaped relationship for health outcomes, where we see adverse effects at the very low intakes and the very high intakes. But that bottom of the U is where we find the nice happy medium, where we see all the positive benefits. So we thinking about all this, the question then becomes, these questions become, how much choline do pregnant women actually need to consume in order to optimize fetal outcomes in brain development, cell development, but still maintain their own maternal health for a long period of time, preventing liver damage, preventing cardiovascular damage if that's one of the risks, as well as maximizing their own cognitive health. We also need to consider whether we have to optimize the diet intake itself, and currently that's primarily what is being recommended. Or should we recommend supplements with the potential danger that comes from overuse or high intakes? Or should we consider like folate? Should we consider some sort of a population level approach? Some of you may or may not know that we started fortification of folate in 1998 here in Canada to reduce the risk for Neurotube defects, and we've seen a substantive risk. And if you look at your label for your bread or your flour, you actually see folic acid on the label as part of that population level approach to reduce the risk for Neurotube defects. So then what's the take-home message? Well, it's really important for healthcare providers, like our dietetic students, to become informed on the importance of choline in reproduction and counsel women of reproductive age, both before and during pregnancy, to improve their consumption of choline-rich foods in order to help ensure that these women are meeting that recommendation for choline. This is some of the references I used in my talk. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Turn on your mic, Jen.
There we are. Thank you so much, Brenda. We are seeing some reactions on our screen from our attendees, and you have given experts, or those that are very attuned and aware of choline and one carbon nutrients, but also novices such as myself, a really strong and excellent introduction to this work, but also a sense of what you are working on and where your research is. I am very grateful. Our audience is very grateful. Thank you for your work.
You're very welcome, Jen.
Thank you.
And everyone else.
Thank you. I do see one, at least one now. So I will, Brenda, if you're comfortable, I will open up the Q&A. I do see one question now. So I will ask our audience, as they think about questions, if they don't want to ask it themselves on mic, to pop it into the chat to me, and I can moderate it. I do see one of our audience members using the reaction button to raise their hand. So I'll call on Dr. Jamie Seabrook now to unmic himself, if he's comfortable, to ask his question.
Hi, Brenda. I just want to say that was a really good presentation. Very, very informative. There was bits and pieces that was a little bit over my head, but I really as simple
as possible, but it's hard.
Thank you. One of the slides that really piqued my interest was with respect to neurotube defects. So early in the presentation, you said that there's been some inconsistent results, and you had a few different studies. I'm just curious if you know, maybe not, has there been any recent systematic reviews or possibly even meta-analyses that have investigated the relationship at an aggregate level to maybe put to rest the association between choline intake in pregnancy and neurotube defects?
That's a really good question, Jamie. I'm not aware of any recent meta-analyses, in part because there's not a huge amount of studies. So when you look at the literature, I highlighted 3 studies, and the truth is there's not much more than that. There's a lot more that's been done with folate, and there is a Cochrane review that did look at the question with folate and answered the question pretty conclusively. But when it comes to choline and some of the other one carbon nutrients, there's even some limited evidence looking at B12 and even B6 in this relationship with that Neurotube defects. There's not a huge amount of research in this area, so it's very hard to come up with very conclusive evidence as to whether or not they really do play a protective role. It's suggestive based on the research, but there's nothing conclusive.
And then if it's okay, one more really easy follow-up. This one is probably a lot easier. It'd be like the title of your presentation is excellent. You know, a nutrient to know. I guess thinking about the title and the way you concluded, is it really healthcare provide? Is there anyone else, like, should the general public know more about choline? And if yes, how do we get the message out? Because certainly it's something, even as a nutrition prof, I know very little about.
Well, some of you may remember or have seen some of the advertisements that the public health bodies put out in bus stations. I remember seeing one for folic acid and folate about being really important during pregnancy. And if you ask the average person, that type of messaging is still really inconsistent. They kind of may have heard of it, and they kind of know they're supposed to take a supplement before pregnancy, but that's pretty much the extent of it.
Yeah.
Choline is even harder for us to get that type of message out, which is why it's really important to target the healthcare providers first, because if they really don't know much about the nutrient, you really cannot expect the general public to understand or know much about it. So I think our first line of defense, if you like, should be getting the information out there in infographics, in handouts to those healthcare providers, the ones who look after women, whether it's dietitians or physicians or even people working in public health. So this might be a project for some students when they do some of these infographics for the CNS conference going forward, because we need this kind of information out there, but right now it's not really out there.
Thanks, Brenda. That was great.
Thanks, Jamie.
That's a fantastic way of thinking about integrating your teaching and your research together, but also creating a really impactful product that has a partnership to it. It'll be interesting to see if and where this idea goes. I see we have another question. Ivana, are you comfortable unmiking yourself?
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hartman. This was a great informative talk. I noticed that for your research, you're looking at choline intake and not necessarily bioavailability of choline in the body. And I was wondering if intake was correlated, if choline intake was correlated with absorption. And the reason I ask is because there have been studies on zinc that show that vegetarians don't consume enough zinc, but they actually found that the body becomes better at absorbing zinc. So vegetarians weren't actually deficient. So, and this was in Western countries. So I was wondering if you know whether the same thing might be happening with choline, that even though maybe vegetarians don't consume the same amount, but could the body be absorbing it better and thus leading to a better bioavailability of choline in the body?
The answer, Ivana, is we really don't know at this point in time. There's not a huge number. There are some researchers out there who are trying to look at all these type of questions. And there is slight differences in terms of whether we're talking the water soluble or the fat soluble forms. What we do know is that there's not a strong correlation between dietary intake and serum concentrations. That being said, I mean, this is one of those areas where it would be more helpful to have more research in. And my previous work has been looking at dietary intake, partly because using the CCH data is fairly, if you know how to use it, it's very accessible. It's a lot harder to and costs a lot more money to do a study where we're looking at intake and blood concentrations. That's on the list of future work to do. I would very much like to know intake, looking at intake in vegetarian women. What do their concentrations look like? At this point in time, I'm not aware of any studies looking at that, although it'd be really interesting to look at. And that's one of the things I really would like to do.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting too. Thank you.
It'd be totally amazing to look at.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks, Ivana.
Thank you so much, Ivana. I'll put the call out one more time for questions, but in the meantime, Brenda, you've given us a snapshot of where you want to go with the study you just mentioned. Can you give us another another look into what is on tap for you? What does your future research look like?
Well, I have recently been working on a survey question, a long questionnaire survey on choline intake, on folate intake, and especially when groups don't consume meat or certain products in their diet. So I'm interested in whether, what happens when vegetarian women, where do they get their choline? Where do they get their folate? If someone practices gluten-free consumption, where are they getting their folate? Because as I mentioned, folate is one of those fortified nutrients we find in our bread, for example. So I really want to know what diets look like in these women who practice these type of more restrictive eating patterns. There's not a lot of research out there, so I'm really interested to see what happens with some of that. And taking that survey, putting it out on Qualtrics, and then potentially also, ideally, getting looking at some blood work as well, and then forming focus groups. So that's one area of research I'm also looking at. I also have a number of projects right now in London Health Sciences Hospital, where we're looking at bone and parenteral nutrition there. We're looking at infant nutrition in blood breastfeeding, in infant nutrition in some of the hospital and some of the clinics there as well, especially whether or not clinic support can be helpful in promoting breastfeeding in babies for longer periods of time in babies that were premature. So I've got my finger in a number of little pies across the area.
Fascinating. Thank you for giving us a window to that. I think we'll invite Kathy Williams to ask the last question of our session.
Thank you. Yes, thanks you for the information. That was very good, Dr. Hartman. I have one question. Sure. This has obviously been around women and pregnancy and so forth. I'm actually here because as a request from my son, who happens to be 38 years old, and I'm a retired dietitian, and he knows more about choline than I do, so I thought I would check it out. So obviously the message is getting out there somehow. I'm not sure how he found out. I texted him, but I haven't heard back. But it's being touted for, obviously, for the male population as well. But he did have a question. He wanted me to ask which choline supplement is better, choline bitartrate versus phosphatidylcholine?
Phosphatidylcholine?
Yeah, there you go.
The evidence is not really suggestive which is the better form. Lecithin is more of a whole food, but truthfully, I'm a dietitian and I'm leery of supplements, other than the exception of a couple. Vitamin D is one of those things I think everybody should be taking, especially because we live in Canada. I mean, let's be honest, especially if you're over 50. I'm really leery about recommending a choline supplement. But if you have choline in foods, I think that's the best place to get it. Lecithin is found in egg yolks, for example, if you might remember. So, consuming, there's evidence suggesting that consuming an egg, if you eat eggs, obviously, is a great way to improve your choline intake during the week. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting that, a couple eggs a week can be quite helpful that way, improving your choline intake. My personal preference, if I were to choose one of the two supplements, I would probably choose the lecithin because it is in a bit more of a whole food form versus a compound. But I'm always leery of supplements at the best of times, honestly.
Okay, so that's how I feel too. Okay, so thank you for that.
I'm not a huge fan of supplements. People in North America consume multivitamins because we think it improves our health, and the evidence suggests that they're actually, for most of us, because we have pretty decent diets overall, there really is no positive benefit to consuming a multi. So that's kind of my default, is that, with the exception of a few supplement nutrients.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question. And Brenda, thank you for all of your perspectives, for your insight, for sharing your research and a window into what is next for you. Our community really appreciates the time that you took to come to us, to share with us. Also, to everyone that is here, thank you for joining us. It is so exciting, as Dr. Frederick King said at the beginning, when there is a synergy where research ideas and knowledge come together that bring us together and we can learn from each other. This Dean Speaker Series really gives us that opportunity, and it continues. Dr. Hartman's talk was the first of this spring 2021 session. If you haven't already registered, on March 19th in the same time slot, 11 a.m., a Brescia community alumna, community member, author, artist, leadership and international development consultant, Anne Gordon, is speaking on her work, and her session is titled Women's Economic Empowerment, Focus on Developing Economies and Agriculture. So if you're interested and want to register, please do so. We look forward for the community coming together again and sharing ideas and knowledge. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Brenda. And yes, we have applause and ta-das all around.
Hi, Loretta. Thank you. Bye.